Hello, everybody, and welcome to episode 28 of On Air. Today, we are joined by our Artist-in-Residence Cammie Staros, and we'll be taking a virtual tour of her exhibition, of her virtual exhibition. I feel like we're going to have some kind of inception happening today. If you also, for those of you at home that are interested in learning more about Cammie and spending a little bit more time with her one-on-one virtually, next week, Saturday, Cammie is doing a workshop called Dysfunctional Wear. It will be on Saturday from 10 a.m. till noon, and all of the materials that you'll need are curbside pickup at Lux. So if you're interested, Victor will be sharing the link for that and sign up and, you know, hang out with Cammie for on Saturday morning. That will be, you know. So today we are taking a closer look at Cammie's virtual exhibition, which you can also explore at your leisure on our Lux app. And if you haven't had an opportunity yet, definitely do it because it's quite an experience. When I was filming this particular video we'll be looking at as Cammie tells us more about the work, definitely made me look a little bit like a crazy person out on the street, but it's such a cool experience. So I'm really excited to be sharing this with you. And if you have questions at any point, shoot them in the chat box or in the Q&A and we'll ask it. It's going to be a very free flow exploring the exhibition with Cammie. So Cammie, thank you so much for joining us. I'll start the video and yeah, let's take a tour.
Great. I just want to say that if you do have questions, and Husha, you also feel free to interrupt. I'm hoping this is a little bit more casual than the artist talk that I gave a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah, definitely. I'll intersect questions and thoughts as well.
Great. And speaking of that other artist talk, I don't know how much overlap there's going to be with the viewer participants, but I will try to cover some ground, but not just not reiterate too much of the same information. But just as a general overview about my work, about this ceramic work that I do in general, that my sort of primary reference is Greek black figure vases, and all of the work in the Lux show is ceramic or ceramic in part. So that reference is just an important one to sort of note. And while some of this work isn't quite as explicit in that reference, it's carried through in the material choice in all these pieces, which is all essentially the same. It's all red earthenware or terracotta clay and terra sigillata, which is a very fine slip for you ceramicists. But it's the same materials that the ancient Greeks and Romans used to decorate their ceramics. And it's all hand built, including the more sort of tabletop sized pieces. So those are just some sort of very basic overviews about my ceramic work in general. I'm gonna talk about some of these pieces kind of broken into categories. And this very first one that the camera just panned away from is the first example I thought I'd talk about. There's another one that's white on top and then has mark making. And there's a white one in the back that all of them have kind of a similar shape. So that white one on the pedestal in a light shaft in the back. And I think of these, I refer to them sort of to myself very casually as eggheads or boulders or something. And I had originally thought I would make a whole show of these pieces. I didn't end up doing that. This is actually probably the closest thing to it I've done. But that shape came out of a few different places. I was looking at connections between classical sculpture and other counterparts, in particular modernist sculpture. And so Brancusi is, to me, sort of the iconic modernist sculptor, and also one who used a lot of classical references in his own work. And this form is in part a reference to his sleeping ewes heads that he did, which were much, much smaller, but he did several of them. And another reason that I wanted to explore the shape and in this scale was the idea of these like body-sized pieces on their side seemed really vulnerable. I had just made a piece that was an like almost body-sized amphora on its side, and I really liked how much more aware I felt of the weight of the work, which is, you know, like in some cases, this piece is not quite as heavy as some, but that first one that you encounter is like significantly heavier than I am, for example. And I think that because they're on their side, definitely making them, you're aware of the weight. The clay does not really want to do that. But I think a viewer is also, can kind of like empathize with the objects and there's a sense of vulnerability. There's also, to me, them being heads on their side makes them feel sort of like toppled ruins. And also them being on their side and heads, I feel like they're kind of like fragmentary while still being self-contained, which also kind of goes into that reference of ruins, but still being its own sort of self-contained sculpture. And pardon me, as the title of this show suggests, I'm really interested in ideas of folding time and tracing history and looking both forward and back. And I'm kind of interested in what ruins do, sort of in general. I think that they kind of celebrate the achievements of past civilizations, and they aestheticize decay, and they also point to a future moment when today's objects are being destroyed, decayed, remembered or not, etc. And the other thing with sort of like the fragmentary body is its relationship to like psychoanalytic theory and feminist theory, which I can go into more if you want, but I'm gonna sort of gloss over at the moment. But there's like lots of depictions of women as headless bodies, or like conventions of veiling women are sort of seen as like a silencing act, but kind of symbolically separating the head and body. So, so that first one that you come to, that's like black with eyes on it, that one is called Whale. And all three of the ones in this show have these sort of like simple swoops that to me define a nose line, and they do so again as kind of a reference to Brancusi, who like simplified and simplified and simplified this form that I'm referencing. He didn't do it in quite the same way, but so on the left is one of the ones I'm talking about. But there's this like just sort of swoop of a nose, and that's like the only shape marker I make towards it being a head.
Cammie, also Whale is the piece that we have in, or not we, that the Craft Contemporary has in their show as well, which is about the body. And for those of you who have not seen their tour, they did a tour last week of their exhibition where we have Cammie's piece, so the piece you see right here in their show as well, which, you know, relates to the body, which was a great connection to that. Sorry, Cammie, back to you.
Not at all. Unfortunately, I can't like pilot this video while talking about it, so you're gonna have to remember the works. But for the paintings of that one,
you can tell me where to go.
Well, I'm talking about Whale for the moment, but I don't know, whatever you want. But the two things I was thinking about that I thought would be noteworthy. Okay, so if you look at it from this perspective, one is that I often think about like reducing a reference down to its like most essential. And I made this at a moment where I was thinking about how to sort of like reference different artists in the like most, you know, minimal way. And to me, Miro, like the simplest way to reference Miro was like an imperfect black oval. That was my like Miro marker. And so this piece uses that sort of ovular, but like wobbly ovular shape. And then the other thing about it is the eyes that are kind of all over it. And those actually come from the Greek figure vases, among other sources. They have eyes that are like completely out of scale with the namesake figures around them. And some, not all the vases, but there are many examples of it. And they're scaled in such a way that anthropomorphize the vases themselves, which is a thing I'm interested in doing in my work that I've like, talked about in other formats with the show. And I'll also talk about it a little bit more during that workshop, which I mentioned. But it's also like a real crossover icon that, you know, the evil eye, the Egyptian eye, the modernist eye. And so that's why I use that signifier a lot. So the one in the corner that's a similar shape called La Chouette. I usually, whales may be an exception to that rule, but I usually title pieces with references to what I see as maybe their like secondary or tertiary reads. That is like, rather than emphasize the thing I think people are gonna see without me pointing to it, I try to point to like something else that they might otherwise miss. So this one, I was thinking about Keith Haring looking at Picasso, looking at Greek figure vases and making this sort of like kaleidoscope flattening of sources through history or something. And the like spout on the top is specifically a reference. Again, this is like something only I would know, but it's a reference to some of Picasso's ceramics and specifically to his ceramic vessel sculptures of owls and ducks. And so La Chouette is owl in French. And he made his ceramics in general in Belarus, a ceramic commune in southeastern France. And then the third one in this sort of like grouping is that white sculpture on the white pedestal. And so that was actually the first one of these I made, I think. That one's called Time Traveler. And the symbols on it are kind of a reference to letter forms without being meaningful, without actually being letters. Or alternatively, they're symbols that are so multiple in their meanings that you can't really pinpoint a single meaning. Like, for example, something that might be a cross or an X or a plus or a cardinal direction, etc. But that's why it has small black patterns on a white background. And at the same time, that's also, there's like one moment in that piece where there's kind of a circle that shows you the red clay underneath. Because I tend to make rules for myself when making pieces and then end up breaking them. And that sort of fold to the red clay body sort of like shows that the white itself is painted on. It's not actually a white surface like writing on paper would be, which is sort of what I was referencing with the black on white. It's on a pedestal that is shaped like a section of fluted column, which in some ways acts as like a body for the head, and also still does this thing with like fragments and ruins. And the title to that one references the duality between like a sleeping head or a vanquished one, between contemporary sculpture and historical reference, between the ruin and the future ruin. And then, so I kind of like group the works in these shows into maybe 3 categories. So I'll go through one more category and then I'll talk about this weird show that I did in general. You might have noticed we're underwater now. So the second grouping includes this one that two that the camera is looking at right now. The black one on the left, the black one in the back, and then this one on the dark blue pedestal that's 2 pieces, which I'll start with. And all of these, I'm referring to these as sex pots for like shorthand, but they're all from a body of work wherein I was thinking about the possible influences of the same Grecian ware, but rather than an art historical influence, the impact they may have had in other kinds of visual cultures and aesthetic traditions. And specifically, I was looking at the way that like valor and victory and gender and eroticism were depicted on the figure vases, and things I could imagine as being like contemporary counterparts. So I sort of see how those ideas were constructed and vestiges of those aesthetics in fashion, which is like perhaps the most obvious, in tattooing, in the relationship between that black line on the bare clay body and the kind of clay, just as a sort of an aside, the kind of clay that you use when working in clay is referred to as a clay body, which is just one of those like lovely poetic parallels. And also I saw vestiges of it in like BDSM as a visual heir to ancient armor. So that piece, this double zipper, like in the middle of the show, that piece is called Artist-in-Residence. And with that one, as well as another one that we'll talk about, I'm still working with this idea of a disembodied head, but I think there's a clear reference to the amphora. I think of those pieces, and also this piece that Cammie's about to pan to, I think. This one, this black one, it's a similar shape. I think of them as like upside down vases to make the head. And the, ooh, there we go. So the painting on this one, there's a zipper motif that goes all the way around it so that there's sort of no front and back, they're the same. And that motif itself is kind of made up of rows of triangles and a Greek key in combination, both of which, not so much the combination, there weren't a lot of zippers on Greek figure vases, but both those elements were really common patterns adorning figure vases. And to me, the primary effect of this piece is of two heads wearing leather masks, but it could also be the parts on the backs of little girls' heads with, with little side buns, or neoprene koozies, or something else. And I really like, I considered making leather masks for that piece, but I really like having those possibilities coexist and keeping a material choice that like makes analogies between the reads instead of like really sort of forcing one read. And then the title of that piece, Eros and Andros, that comes from two of the erotes, which are the winged love gods in Greek mythology, Eros being the most famous of them. And it can be translated as love and requited love. And then, so this piece that we're on right now, this one's called A Sharp Intake of Breath. And it's one of a few of these medium scale vessels that I made. It's probably bigger than it looks from that freeze frame. It's like 25, 26 inches high, something like that. And it's actually not a vessel. It's the shell of a vessel. So the bottom is built like the top. There's no floor to it at all, which is one of many tactics that I employ repeatedly to sort of like frustrate the idea of utility and expectations in general for these objects. The painting on this one and on the next one I'll talk about is really similar. And on both of them, it's like a very simple black. And then there are these bare ceramic zones around the piercings. And so the painting, I think, is like, maybe it's like a latex suit, or maybe it's just a minimal pattern, or maybe those clay circles are analogous to the red figures in red figure vases, which are essentially the same as black figure vases, except that the negative space is what's painted black instead of the figure. So the figures are left the red clay color. And again, in both of them, I'm using these brass piercings sort of in place of handles. And they're made like scaled up septum or navel rings. So they have threaded balls on the inside, but you can't really see those balls on either of these pieces. You can on some other ones. On this one's called Soliloquy with a Chorus. And on this one, it's on a turned wood pedestal, which you can see from some views, but at least on my screen, it's pretty solid there, but it's not. It's kind of like goes in and out in like a cylindrical pattern, which is another reference to Brancusi. And I was just kind of jumping from one to the other, but I think it pretty much covered those. So those were sort of the specific pieces of this show that I was going to talk about. And then again, I was going to address the sort of like structure of the exhibition as a whole.
So Cammie, maybe before we jump into that, can
Sure.
you, I think what leads into kind of the idea of this exhibition is what you're working on right now, and the piece that you're working on for the residency itself. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about that, and then we can talk about the exhibition.
Sure. So I sat myself in this particular point in my studio so that you could see this aquarium vitrine behind me, which is a piece I'm working on. It's going to be, it'll be embedded into a wall, which is why the pedestal and the light are so sort of like rough and tumble looking right now. But I'm making a whole series of these pieces that are kind of museological vitrines that are flooded and creating biospheres with that structure, so that they're again an analogy between a vitrine and an aquarium. And they all house, you might not be able to tell what that thing is in the aquarium, but it's another ceramic. So they all house ceramics as a vitrine in the Met or the British Museum or something would. Mostly they're like one central ceramic within a vitrine slightly larger than it. But it's submerged in water and has shares the space with aquatic life. And so it's hopefully doing this thing where it's like kind of pointing to this idea that I talk about in the press release for the show at Lux about an abandoned museum, a forgotten museum that's been reclaimed by nature. And it's also hopefully doing sort of double duty, like referencing the underwater discoveries of antiquities that the pieces are referencing, and also this idea of like the possibilities for the future of today's objects, and particularly in this moment of like impending political and climate crises. And I was working on them before the pandemic, but also in this moment of sort of abandoned spaces and like the public spaces being for the first time like barred from the public, or at least the first time in our memory. And so that like led quite naturally to this idea for this particular show. Again, the idea of like an abandoned museum and even a flooded museum was one I had been thinking about for a long time. So it took, 20 seconds after Lux suggested doing the show as a virtual experience, as a virtual exhibition, for me to suggest this particular twist on it. I knew though that you know, that if I were going to do a virtual exhibition, I wanted it to explore territory that I couldn't do in like a physical space in an ordinary show, and that I wanted to bend the rules of what would be physically possible. So these aquarium vitrine pieces are made with real world constraints in mind, knowing that I can't flood an exhibition space. And the show at Lux allowed me to flood an exhibition space with virtual water, if not real water. And again, I think all of these things, both these vitrine pieces and this show, go back to that idea of ruins and to the climate threats, especially because the water level rises in this Lux show. And the idea of making sort of tomorrow's relics, future relics. And another thing about ruins is that they're in this sort of like liminal space. They're man-made objects or architecture, but they're like in the process of decay. They're in that process that I mentioned of being reclaimed by nature. And so the show itself, the sort of environment, the moss on the walls, the algae, whatever you're seeing, reflects that like slippage into an organic state that I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I really love, there's so many different concepts that come into play with what you're working on now. I'll turn my camera on, maybe. You know, we've talked about this a lot before COVID happened on how can we think about different ways of displaying, right? I think you, in your talk, you've talked a lot about the ways that you've displayed your works in the past, and kind of thinking of how can we push ways of display and experiencing at Lux during your residency. And I know we had to completely rethink that concept, but what I think is so interesting with this and how you're tying in, how you're thinking about it now with the aquariums and these kind of like underwater mausoleums, and like you're talking about with everything being abandoned, but also the idea of antiquity and antique, oh my goodness, English, antique vessels in museums, and how museums themselves become mausoleums, where these objects, you know, lose all of its identity. Like they're stripped from the common day use that they used to have, or from this kind of really visceral experience with the people that made them. And I think, you know, with Lux being abandoned in some way right now, and it being flooded, and we're at the bottom of, you know, the ocean in some way, as a mausoleum of many different ways. I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I'm really excited that we got to do this with you.
Yeah, I feel like it makes a lot of sense with where the world is right now and where my own head was even before the world caught up to it. It's already in a dark place. Yeah, one thing I would maybe say a little bit differently from the way you had was less maybe that museums strip objects of their meaning, and that they mean new things when they're contextualized in that way. And that museological context is, you know, is primary in the way anybody now understand, maybe not the only way, but again, the primary way that contemporary people engage with these antique objects that I'm referencing. And so, yeah, we don't even like, we know from scholarship somewhat of like what they might have meant in their day, but I don't think you can separate the experience of learning about them through the museum or through like an art history 101 class. This like is what they mean now.
Yeah, I really like that. I want to open it up to questions too from the audience. If you have any questions for Cammie about the exhibition or some of the works that we've looked at, now is the best time to do that. Cammie, I also really love this piece and the way that you talk about it. And I know that violence is a big part of the conversation that you're having in different ways. And I'm really curious how you approach those concepts when you're in some ways drowning them, right? Do you feel like it changes the language around, BDSM and language of violence, especially, in mythology as well? How do you approach that now that it's underwater?
Well, of course, I made all these objects before they were underwater. Um, so the approach has been made. But I think that's a really interesting question. I mean, I think that they are like a pretty contemporary take on an age-old idea. And so putting them underwater sort of like automatically ages them in this way. But I don't know if I think that it drowns them in its own sort of violent action. The show doesn't feel violent to me. Maybe because the viewer goes underwater with the objects. It doesn't so much seem like the objects are lost from view so much as that the whole thing, the whole shebang is lost to the outside world.
Yeah, more of a reflection on what we find ourselves in now, not that these are gone from the world, they're just a little bit more hidden because currently we're underwater, but yeah, we'll dry up again. And yeah, I love that. Well, I think I'll end it there, Cammie. Thank you so much for giving us a tour of your virtual exhibition, and I encourage everybody to take some time. You've all seen my street now, so.
Yeah, it is. It's like a little funny to go through this when you're not in control of it because it's not a film, and it's definitely a different experience to use the app and sort of move through it with your own body.
Oh, we did have one question come in. If you can talk about the white piece on the steel pedestal, do you mean this particular piece?
I think it probably means the one that's a little bit to the right of that piece, the anatomy of the object.
Oh, yeah.
That's my guess. All these three pieces, though, on stands, they all sort of reference to a greater or lesser degree the convention of displaying African masks on these steel stands with a base. And we should mention that I'm interested in conventions of display in general. That is like one of many that I think, I don't know, it's just sort of like funny to me how it's become such a convention, how even without the objects themselves, those stands are recognizable and become sort of attached to the objects they so often present. And by scaling it up and putting this piece on it, so this piece is shaped kind of like those upside down amphora that make up Artist-in-Residence and also Soliloquy of the Chorus. But it's cut away from the back, as you can see, or from this side, so that and then I think because it's on that stand, even though it's scaled up so much, it becomes kind of a mask or a helmet by virtue of association. So there's actually the 3D rendering doesn't really show it, but when you look at the actual object, which is behind me, from this side, there's sort of two black rectangles at what would be eye level. And then when you look at it from the face, which maybe you can see actually better behind me than in the show at the moment, but it has a pattern of cracks. And so I was thinking a lot about like different approaches to repair and conservation. And I've always really liked the classical objects that you can trace sort of like different eras and different ideologies of conservation and how much it should, how present it should feel in the object, how visible the repair should be. And you can kind of like trace different different ideologies through different times on the same work. And so that piece has like a pattern painted on it of cracks. And they're all sort of like slightly different shades of white. They're like pinkish white or bluish white. And then that one zone where you can see the clay through it. And yeah, just like taking both the eye holes in the back and the cracks, both these things that are like thought of as, you know, by definition, they sort of like, they penetrate an object, right? That's a hole and a crack are both like active penetrations in a way, or active, they're like, they cut through the piece in theory, but then I'm like painting them on. So I'm sort of rendering them as a pattern instead. Yeah, I don't know, is that enough? Does that answer the question? Oh, and it's called The Anatomy of an Object for all those reasons, because I think that there's that like cutting away aspect of this piece, which feels kind of anatomical to me. And then I think, again, because of that analogy with a mask or a helmet, it becomes a little bit skull-like. So that's another reason.
Great, thanks so much, Cammie. I think that was a perfect note to end on. Thank you everybody so much for joining us today. And I look forward to seeing you next week. And Cammie, thank you again for sharing more about the show and for being here today.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody.
Bye.